What I want to do before we jump into John chapter 4, if you're new with us, you may not know this, but we're studying through the entire book of John, the Gospel of John, and we'll probably spend, I don't know, I thought it was going to be a few months, it's probably going to be a few years in this book. Some of you are mad at me for saying that, but whatever. And so if you would, though, we're going to be in John chapter 4. If you don't have a Bible or own a Bible, the one that's in your seat is yours to keep. That's your gift. It's our gift to you. And but if you own a Bible, if you would open up to John chapter 4, we're going to be in John chapter 4, starting in verse 43, moving through verse 54. But before we get started there, as you're turning there, I want to read something to you out of John chapter 20 to give us a little bit of context. We have touched on this verse multiple times as we begin to study through this book. And what this verse does is it helps us understand the context in which John is writing, right? And so John, the gospel writer, is writing to us for a specific reason. And so we need to know that so we have context to understand what some of these stories mean to us. So let's open up. You guys open up John chapter 4. Let me read really fast. John chapter 20, starting in verse 30 and 31. The title of this little paragraph in my ESV Bible is "The Purpose of This Book." Verse 30, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And so very, very obviously, we have a clear understanding of why John is writing this. John is writing this that we might believe and see that Christ is the Son of God, and that by believing we might have life in him. And so everything that is written in this book is so that we might believe and have life. That's what this gospel is about. That's what this gospel is written for. And so we need to keep that in mind as we study through John chapter 4, verse 43 through 54. Now, before we get started into the verses that we will study today, I want to create some context so that we can understand where we're going, because I think that there's a big theme in this text. Throughout the world and the way that we live as human beings, God has established certain principles and laws among the earth. I mean, life is just the way it is because that's the way it is. That's the way God created it. For instance, like there's the law of gravity, right? The law of gravity means that if you are up, you will come down. If you, what must go up must come down. If you jump, you will come down. I mean, if you don't believe me, jump off a building and we'll argue about it on your way down. It's just a law that God has created. There's different type of laws. There's the law of motion. There's all sorts of different laws, and there's all sorts of different principles. There's the principle of Andy Stanley talks about the principle of the path, which is your direction, not your intention, determines your destination. So where you're headed is where you're actually going to go, no matter what you intend to do. Like if you intend to go north, but you head south, you're going to go south, even if you wanted to go north, right? And so there's all these different types of principles. There's the principle of contradiction. You can't be and not be at the same time. So for instance, it can't be raining outside and not raining outside at the same time. That's a contradiction. It's a principle. It's just the way things are. And so there's lots of different principles in the world that God has established. And that's just true. That's just the way that the world works. And so what we're going to see in this text, though, is a specific principle, which I want to call the principle of cycles. There is a cycle that we will see in this text that will make sense to us as we work through it. And so this is what a cycle is. A cycle is a series of events that comes full circle and repeats itself, right? Some of you are like, why are you talking about this? Get to the Bible. I'll get there, but you need some context. Okay, so a cycle is something that if it starts, it will go full circle and come back. And so there's all sorts of different cycles that exist in our psyche. It could be the cycle of addiction, right? And so where we start as somebody, I grew up with this. We had somebody in our family that was an alcoholic. And so if you start using will then then lead to shame, which then at time will lead, because we are in shame, to a craving, which will then lead back to using again. It's a cycle. There's the poverty cycle, right? If you're typically grown up in a poor environment, oftentimes that poor environment doesn't allow us to have affordable education, and then which typically leads to not good job opportunities, which typically leads to poverty again. And so it's a cycle. And the cycles just exist. It's just the way it is. It's a principle that exists, okay? Depression is another one. If you're depressed, it typically will lead you into fatigue or isolation, which then leads you into the inability to handle responsibility, which then what? Leads to depression, greater depression. And so there's all sorts of cycles that exist, and what we're going to see here in this text is that God is teaching us through this text that there is also a cycle when it comes to Him and belief in Him. And typically when we think of these cycles, we typically think of them in negative notions, right? And so we think of it as, depression leads to another cycle. Addiction will lead to having more addiction. And so we typically think them in negative terms, but in this particular context, what we're going to see is this is a really incredible, God-ordained, God-saturated cycle that if done right, we will grow. God will use this to sanctify us. Sanctify simply means to mature in time. Set us apart, and we will be set apart and mature into the things of God, to the things of Christ, and be made much more like Him over time. It's a progressive work that God does. And so what we want to do is learn what this means. Now, so let me give you some context of where we're going to be, and then we'll jump into it. Okay, we good? Y'all still with me? I know it was kind of like a philosophical lesson that you guys were like, where's he going? Okay, we're getting there. All right, so here we are in John chapter 4. Jesus had just had an encounter with the woman at the well. This woman was an outcast. She was a woman who was very promiscuous in her setting, and she was considered just outcasted by her people. She was a Samaritan woman. And Jesus comes to her and he says, if you drink of this water, this living water, you will never thirst again. And they go back and forth until she's able to fully understand what it is that Christ is talking about. And he explains this to her in ways that she'll understand. And she leaves as a believer, goes into her context, into her region. And then all of a sudden, Christ then comes with her and he's ministering to, and she's ministering to that entire region. And all of a sudden, there's this big transformation in that area. And so when that's done, we're going to pick it up in John chapter 4, starting in verse 43, and this is what it says. John chapter 4, verse 43. After 2 days, so he was there for 2 days, he departed for Galilee. For Jesus himself has testified that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, for they too had gone to the feast. Now, before we get started into the remainder of the text, I want to kind of just stop there and touch on something. So very, very honestly here, John is testifying that a prophet, Christ, has no honor in his hometown. He's heading back to Galilee, and John is saying that he doesn't have honor in this town. They welcome him into this town, but he doesn't receive his honor, his rightful honor as the Son of God in this town. Now, some of us may think that that's irrelevant, but I think that's very relevant, and we need to touch on this really, really fast. I think that this same temptation exists today in the church and for us. And I think that there's two reasons why I feel like this can hinder us if we're not careful. So Christ is coming on the scene and he's not getting honor in his hometown. Why would that be? Why isn't he receiving honor from these people? Let's talk about that. And I think that there's two reasons. The first reason is that pride. There's a certain pride that comes from those people of his town because there's something special about Christ and they're affiliated with it. So let me further explain what I mean. These people where Christ lived, they loved the miracles that he was doing. They loved it. It was amazing. I mean, he's turning water into wine. He's healing people. He's casting out demons. There's more things that Christ is doing miraculously that are even written in the book. And so Christ is doing all these things, and it's hindering their ability to see him as the miracle worker. They're rather just excited about, they're hindering his ability to see him as the Son of God. They're rather just excited about him being a miracle worker. So they're excited about the miracles, but they're missing who he really is. Now, part of this is because I feel like the miracles are tied to their ego. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Being from his hometown and seeing Christ do what he's done connects them to Christ automatically, right? And so therefore, the miracles are more about them than it is about Christ. Well, what does that even mean, Matt? Okay, it's like the bandwagon effect, right? And so they're jumping on the Christ bandwagon because of what he's able to do, not because of who he is. It's like, let me explain it we're in New England, so you guys need sports illustrations, right? I mean, that's just how you roll, okay? And so let me explain this. Pats, the Patriots, right? 2001, everybody jumped on the Patriots bandwagon. Why? Bledsoe went out, Brady jumped on board, and the thing was insane. Now, it didn't matter where you were from. If you had any connection at all to New England, you were a Pats fan that year. You were. You were just excited to see what was going on. You jumped on the bandwagon. And same was true in 2004 with the Sox came back against the Yankees, right? I mean, last night was a really bad game, and I'm really sorry for all of y'all that watched that. I'm sorry about that. But it's true. In 2004, everybody jumped on the Sox bandwagon. They did. I mean, you could have been from Bangladesh. It did not matter. But if you had any affiliation to Boston, you were in, right? You could have had a Boston Terrier and like, oh, that's my team. I mean, you were just in. It was a bandwagon effect. It was something that you had an emotional attachment to at some level. So therefore, all of a sudden, you're a fan. And that's what was going on here in this context, right? These people had an emotional attachment to Christ because he's from their town. And so they love the miracle worker, but they will not acknowledge him as the Son of God. Same is true like when the Pats have had bad seasons in 2001. I mean, after 2001, which there haven't been many. But when it's happened, all those Patriot fans that jumped on the bandwagon seem to disappear, don't they? You true fans are like, yes, they do. Okay. So, why is this important? Why is this relevant? Well, because I think that we have this same existence here in the evangelical world. I think that this exists in the Christian world. And in the Christian world, what's so unique about it is that because it's Christian and because it's of God and because it's a good thing, we could jump on certain Christian bandwagons, and it's hard to see our idolatry in that. And it's hard to come to terms that oftentimes we'll jump on a Christian bandwagon but totally neglect Christ. And so what do you mean? Well, we'll jump on the music style bandwagon, right? I like hymns. I like contemporary music. I like Michael W. Smith. Seriously? Okay. And so we'll jump on a bandwagon and we'll totally neglect the fact that we get to know Christ. We'll jump on the Reformed theology bandwagon. I hate John Calvin. I love John Calvin. Seriously? That's what you want to argue about? Your theology is neglecting your ability to actually run after Christ because you're so consumed with your theology that sometimes we forget Christ. Now look I think good sound doctrine is important. I think good theological truths are important. They are important. But if they negate our ability to run after the King, then we've missed it. We do this all the time. So there's some of y'all now who are on the Netcast bandwagon. Oh, Netcast is the greatest thing since Jesus walked the earth. Really? No, Jesus is the greatest thing since Jesus walked the earth. Can I get an amen? Jesus is the greatest thing since Jesus walked the earth because he still exists and is still alive today. And Netcast is a small portion of that. Don't jump on a movement. Don't jump on a movement and forget why the movement was established. To exalt the King of Kings. So that's one very easy way, very real way in which the evangelical community has done this. And there's another reason I think that we will see in this text that why they are not able to give Christ the honor in which he deserves. And I think they're just so familiar with him, right? I mean, like, this is little Jesus. You know, little Jesus. I remember little Jesus when he stubbed his finger, making chairs with his dad. That's little Jesus. That's cute old Jesus. That's Jesus. Don't you remember? Jesus, his mother claimed to be a virgin. You remember that? That was hysterical. You guys, you know what I'm talking about? So they were so familiar with Christ that it hindered their ability to actually see who he was as the Son of God. And we do this too. I mean, what's amazing to me is in my own life, at times I can read the scriptures and not have a shock value when you see some of the things that are in there. I mean, I could be so familiar with God's word that oftentimes I'll read it and it just doesn't astonish me. Feel what I'm saying? Y'all ever been there? No, just you, Pastor. Okay, thanks. Great. I mean, we could be so familiar with Christianity, so familiar with the word, so familiar with evangelicalism, what to do, what not to do, good theology, what we believe, what we understand, that it ceases to shock us. And let me explain that the gospel is absolutely shocking. And this crawls into the church, and what the church tries to do is tries to make the gospel more creative. This is my temptation on Easter, right? I was thinking, what's the most creative way to explain the resurrection? Seriously? He rose from the dead. I got to get creative with that? Really? But this is our temptation. It's to not allow the scriptures to shock us. And in the end, I believe that comes down to a belief issue. That do we really believe that it's true? Okay. So now enters the official. This is the story of the official's son. Let's continue reading, verse 46. So he, Jesus, came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down to heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Let me explain what's going on here. Most of the commentaries believe that this official was a Gentile who was affiliated with King Herod. And King Herod was a really wicked king. He was actually not even really a king. He oversaw a region, but he really didn't have king dominion. And what was going on here is that this official left camp and ran to Capernaum and tried to find Christ. He's not a Jew, which is awkward here because Jesus has come. If you read the text, Jesus has come for the Jews, right? Paul was sent to the Gentiles. So here's a Gentile coming to Christ. And so Jesus is dealing with a Gentile here. He's left his son. He's traveled about 20 miles. I don't know how he got there, if he was walking or hitching a ride with a camel. I'm not really sure. But he travels 20 miles to find Christ. And he gets there. And the actual Greek word for the word ask in verse 47, it says, he went to him and asked him. That word ask is aroda. And actually, it's actually a very insistent word. It's not like he's asking. He's pleading with Christ. He's begging him, will you please come and heal my son? You've got to come, Christ. You've got to come, Jesus. My son is sick. He's dying. And Christ responds in verse 48. So Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And he does something interesting here too. If you don't know the Greek, you wouldn't understand this unless it's shown to you. But that word you is actually, unless you, it's a plural word, and it actually means you all, right? Jesus got like Southern on him. He was like, unless y'all. It means you all. So he is all-knowing, but yet he blankets this man into the same context as the Jews who won't believe. He simply looks at him, and it's kind of frustrating if you're looking at it from a father's perspective, because he's looking at him. This man is pleading for his son's life, and all Christ says to him is, unless you see a sign and wonder, you don't believe. He's rebuking a man who's coming to him desperate for his son. And not just that, he affiliates him automatically with this other group of people who are the Jews and will not give him honor the way that he deserves. This is interesting. Now, there's a part of me that hates this and there's a part of me that loves this. The part of me that's a dad hates this, right? Because if I'm a father and I've just traveled 20 miles because my son is about to die, and for some reason I think that Jesus, you are his only hope. You're it. There's no one else. I've traveled to find you and I've found you. And the thing I could say to you is, can you please, I believe enough, can you please just come to my house and put your hands on this child so that he will live? And your response is, unless I see signs and wonders, I'm not trying to get into this with you, Jesus. I just need my son healed. So there's a part of me that hates this when I read it, because it seems like Christ is being very brash and harsh. But then there's another part of me that loves it, because Jesus just doesn't ever let us put him in a box, right? He just doesn't. I mean, the second you think he's being, he's all compassionate, he's all loving, and he never has a harsh moment. The second we view him in that light, what does he do? He gives you a harsh word, or he's whipping you out of a temple like he did in John chapter 2. But then the second you view him from that light and that perspective, he's the one that's holding you in your darkest moment. He's the one who's weeping with you because you're hurting. And so it's this weird paradigm where in one instance he seems to be all one way, and in another instance he's something completely different. And if we're honest, it's absolutely fascinating how Christ never lets us fully in. He always allows an element of mystery. This is why we'll never arrive until it's over. Let's continue to see what happens now in the official's response. The official says to him, I love this because he doesn't even skip a beat. The official says, sir, come down, before my child dies. Like, it didn't even hinder him. He didn't even skip a beat. Christ is saying, you're not going to believe unless you see signs and wonders. And in reality, he's probably saying that in a way that's saying, it disgusts me that you won't believe unless you see a sign and wonder. And the Gentile doesn't even flinch. He says, just come. Can you just come? I'm not trying to get in this. Will you just come so my son does not die? And then Jesus says to him, go, your son will live. And it's really hard in the text to understand someone's tone, right? It's like when you read an email or when you read a text message and you're like, that's all caps. Is he ticked off? Like, it's like, it's really hard to understand tone. But personally, when I read this, I think that he is actually testing him. He's looking at him and saying, go, he'll be healed. Sure, go, he'll be healed. He's testing him. He's in an attempt to lead this man into greater belief than he currently has. He's testing him. Right? This man has enough belief in Jesus to find him and ask him to perform a miracle by coming to his house. He has enough belief to do that, but Christ is then going to test this man to try to attempt to grow his belief. Will you not just believe me coming and showing you a miracle? Will you actually believe my word? He's challenging him. He's saying, will you move from believing in me as a miracle worker from here and believe in me in a much deeper way in which you go back your 15, 20 miles and not just believe that when I touch somebody I could heal them, but even from a distance, I could heal your son. And I believe that it's a test. And this man, I believe, passes. Now, it's true that God does test us, right? He doesn't tempt us, right? There's a difference between temptation and testing. Testing ought to lead to greater faith. When God tests us, he's testing us into a greater faith. When we're tempted, we are tempted into sin. There's a difference. It's a whole nother sermon that would take probably 4 hours to break down. But this man believed the word that Jesus spoke, verse 50, and went on his way. And I believe that the entire story, everything in this text, hinges on verse 50. Let me read that. Jesus says to him, go, your son will live. This man has traveled 20 miles. Go back, your son will live. The man believed the word that Christ spoke to him and went on his way. The man believes what Jesus says. Your son will live. And then he acts in obedience. He didn't complain. Well, Jesus, I need you to come. If you don't come with me, it's not going to happen. I need you to put your hands up. He didn't complain to him. He didn't argue with him. Why you got to be like this? Why you got to be harsh with me? He didn't argue with him. He listened to his word, believed it, and reacted in obedience. And in the process, his son was healed. Listen to what happens next, verse 51. As he was going down, his servant met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour and that he began to get better. And so the guy is still a skeptic, right? He's like me. So Jesus says, go, he's going to be healed. And then the servant's coming and he's running and he meets him part way somewhere. He finds him somewhere halfway. Who knows how far it was. And he says to him, your son's been healed. The fever broke. And he's like, wait a second. I don't know if this was Jesus or not. When did it happen? Well, we do this all the time, right? We'll pray that God will heal somebody and we're like, oh, that was just the body working right. Okay. And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed. Now, this is interesting here because already in the text it says that the man believed his word and left. But here we're seeing in the 7th hour when he recognizes what happened, he himself believed. What does that mean? He already believed. He's believing again. What does that mean? I believe this. I believe very clearly that, yes, he already believed, but he has now been brought into greater belief. Belief grows. And watch how this spreads, right? And then all his household believed. And so the belief started as I'm believing who he is, then I believe in his word, then now all of a sudden I come back and I see it and now I have greater belief, and that greater belief will now spread into a greater belief in my household, and belief begins to grow and grow and grow. And here's the cycle. Here's what I was talking about in the very beginning of this message. There is a cycle to this. This is what happens for believers, for Christians, that as we begin to believe the gospel and what he's done for us, as we believe Christ and who he is, and that belief is so great that it leads to obedience, then through that obedience, it walks us into greater joy. And that greater joy that we have, or that miraculous thing that we get to witness as we believe and walk in obedience, we see life and life abundantly, like we see in John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, the context. He's teaching us to understand this in the context of belief, which leads to life. So we believe, we obey, which leads to life, which then leads to greater belief, which then leads to obeying even greaterly, which then leads to more life, which then leads to more belief. And it's a cycle that goes on. It's the process of sanctification. This is how it works. Belief, true belief, real belief, not intellectual, I believe in who he is, but true life-transforming belief leads to obedience, which then leads to life, which then leads to greater obedience, which then leads to life, which leads to greater belief. It's a cycle. It's how it works. And so most of us will say we believe, but we won't be obedient, so therefore we won't have life. And because we are not following the cycle, really our belief is stagnant. It's not growing. It's the same simply because our belief is not leading us to obey, and because we're not obeying, it's revealing to us that we really don't believe. Does that make sense? So what does this mean, Matt? Give me some application, right? Stop with the truths, man. Tell me how this thing works in my life, I want to know how to apply this. Story of my life. Everyone wants to know how to apply. All right. I'll tell you, but you might get mad at me. I'm just warning you up front. You're not going to like it. Because belief that doesn't lead to obedience reveals to you that you truly don't believe, which means that you're not going to like me because I'm telling you, you don't really believe this. So let's look at some areas that I was thinking through. Jesus calls us in our marriages to be selfless. That's what he calls us to be. He says that in our marriages, for married people here, and for those who aspire to be married one day, that marriage isn't about your pleasure. There's pleasure in marriage, Marriage isn't about your happiness. There might be happiness in marriage. Marriage isn't about you getting what you need. It's not. Marriage is about denying yourself and existing for the joy and benefit of your spouse. That's what it's about. And so obedience in this context means believe the gospel. Believe what Christ has to say. And then live in your marriage selflessly. And stop trying to make your spouse exist for you. And don't nudge each other right now, okay? I see some things going on here I don't like. All right, y'all are like, You listening to him? I don't want none of that. But believe, obey, and let me promise you something. As you begin to do that, there will be a joy and miracles and life that will happen in your marriage that will lead you into greater belief. Promise. Let's talk about, for our single people, or even our married people, let's talk about purity in our sexuality. Why does he have to go there? Yeah, well, because you don't want me to, that's why. Jesus says to not be sexually committed. This is it. This is the text. This is what the Bible speaks of. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 6. Do not be sexually committed unless you're first emotionally, relationally, spiritually, legally committed. That's it. That's it. That's all. That's it. Stop using sexual intimacy as a means of hiding the reality that you don't have real, true intimacy. And when you do it, you will find a life and a joy in which you could not understand unless you obey. It's just true. If we're honest, we can claim to believe, but if we lack obedience in this area, truth is we don't have true fulfilled life. Which simply means also that we're not pursuing or running towards greater belief. The reason why your belief hasn't grown is because you have yet to obey. Now, I'm not talking about messing up, stumbling, and falling. I'm talking about taking the text and twisting it to your own liking, which in reality makes you God, and you're not. Believe in Jesus, fight for true intimacy, fight against false intimacy, and watch the miraculous happen, which will lead to greater belief. Let's talk about money. I really didn't want to do this one. Let's talk about it though, right? I mean, I know that the church has really, really done a poor job in dealing with finances, right? I mean, the second money gets brought up in church, everyone's like, ugh, we don't want to talk about it. Look, I'm not telling you, we don't need your money. God doesn't need your money. But he does have a lot to say about our money. He does. And most pastors want to either shy away from this, or because they are not hitting their budget correctly, they need to preach on it too much, or talk about it too much, or talk about it even in unethical, unbiblical ways. But this is what the text would tell us about how to handle our money. Jesus says that earthly possessions will perish away after this life, and it's better to give than it is to receive. He says that if you attempt to find your security in your riches, you will not be satisfied. He also says that if you want to know where your true God is, look at how you spend your money. Jesus talked more about money than he did hell. And if I'm honest, it makes me uncomfortable as well. We so badly want to hoard our resources to ourselves because in doing so, it brings us security. But in that security, we're finding our security outside of true, real, authentic, transforming belief in Christ because you think that you could take care of yourself. And Jesus says simply, he simply says, just where your money is, that's where your heart's going to be. So therefore, put your money somewhere where you want your heart to be. And if you're a believer, your heart should be with the Lord. It just should. I know it's uncomfortable, but it's truth. And I will not hide behind a fear of confronting Western culture's idolatry, which simply says it's all about, number one, hoard everything for you, give when it's convenient. It's just not the way it works. If you're mad at me, read your Bible. When it comes to this, believe in Christ. Believe what he has to say about it. Believe that the gospel is true, in which life is found in an outpouring of who we are. That consists of everything. And in so doing that, watch how God honors that. Watch how you don't become so self-consumed. And watch how you find a joy that you did not know was possible to attain, which will then lead you into greater belief. It's a cycle. Listen, this works for every single area in our life as Christians. I'm talking to the Christian. If you don't believe what we believe, if you don't believe that Christ's sacrificial death on the cross paid the penalty for our sin, his resurrection reveals to us and claims victory over Satan, sin, and death, and that belief in that message gives us transformation through the power of that message. If you don't believe that, then all of this is irrelevant to you, and I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the person who claims to believe, because in belief, you reveal your belief through obedience, which then leads to greater life, which then will lead to greater obedience as the process of sanctification. And a lot of us are not growing simply because our belief is not leading us to obey. And so my thing here is this: just believe enough to obey him. And in that, you will see things that you never believed were possible, like a son being brought back to health. Now, I'm not a prosperity guy, that if you believe this, this will occur, but it wouldn't have occurred had he not believed.